She was just a little girl on a cold sidewalk. Until one moment changed everything. Subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the streets of Brooklyn still glistened under a heavy gray sky. Water dripped from fire escapes and ran in narrow streams along the curbs. The air smelled of damp concrete and distant coffee from the corner diner. People moved quickly, heads down, coats pulled tight against the lingering chill. No one slowed, no one looked around. Jonathan Miles did. He had just turned off Fulton Street, a brown paper bag from O'Malley's Deli tucked under his arm, when something caught his eye. At the base of a leaning street lamp, small and still as a forgotten doll, a little girl sat curled up against the metal pole. She couldn't have been more than 6. Her pale yellow dress was soaked through, clinging to her like wet tissue. Bare feet tucked under her, arms wrapped around her knees. She stared at the ground without moving. Her short, tightly coiled hair stuck to her forehead in damp curls, and her face, delicate, beautiful, and blank, looked as if it had forgotten how to hope. Jonathan stopped. The crowd flowed around him, muttering in annoyance as they sidestepped. He didn't care. He crouched down slowly. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" Her head lifted just enough for their eyes to meet. Big, deep brown eyes that seemed older than her years, hollow and exhausted. "You okay?" he asked gently. She blinked once, then whispered one word. "Cold." That single syllable landed like a weight in Jonathan's chest. He shrugged out of his tan jacket, the one he'd worn for years, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. She didn't resist when he slid his arms under her and lifted her. Her tiny fingers clung to his shirt. Her head pressed into the crook of his neck, as if she'd always known it was safe there. Jonathan walked straight home. His apartment was small, 2 rooms above a bakery, but warm in ways that mattered. Books lined the shelves, and framed photographs covered the walls. Camille, his late wife, smiling in a summer dress. Maya, their daughter, caught mid-laugh in a candid shot from her school years. Camille had died 2 years after Maya's fatal car accident. Since then, Jonathan's days had been quiet to the point of emptiness. Morning walks, crossword puzzles, tea at the kitchen table. He laid the girl gently on his old plaid couch and covered her with a blanket. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just closed her eyes and stayed still. He made soup, the same chicken noodle recipe Camille used to make, and set it in front of her. She ate slowly, as though unused to regular meals. When the bowl was empty, Jonathan sat in the armchair across from her. "What's your name?" Her voice was barely audible. "Imani. Do you know where your parents are?" She shook her head, her gaze dropping to her lap. "Did someone hurt you?" A pause. No answer. That night, she slept on the couch, still wrapped in his jacket. Jonathan stayed in the armchair nearby, watching over her like a sentry. Outside, the rain started again, but inside, the only sound was her steady breathing. The next morning, Jonathan picked up the phone and called social services. Within an hour, there was a knock on the door. Marisol Rivera, a caseworker in her 40s, stepped inside, her clipboard in hand. She crouched in front of Imani, speaking in a warm, measured tone. The girl gave short, quiet answers, most of them incomplete. "No last name?" Marisol asked Jonathan, glancing at her notes. He shook his head. "She hasn't said?" "We ran her photo through the national database," Marisol said. "No matches, no active missing child reports. It's possible she was never officially registered or was abandoned." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "So what happens now?" "Normally she'd go into foster care," Marisol explained, "but the system is overloaded. There is a fast-track option, temporary guardianship if you're willing. You'd have to pass a background check, but she could stay here instead of going into a shelter." Jonathan didn't even think. "I'll take her!" Marisol's pen hovered over her clipboard. "You're certain? It's a big commitment?" "I'm certain," he said, his voice steady. "No one should feel invisible. Not while I'm here." Marisol nodded, made a note, and handed him the initial paperwork. "I'll start the process today. She can stay until we sort it out." After she left, Jonathan found Imani sitting by the upright piano in the corner of the living room. It had been Camille's pride, untouched for years. Her small fingers hovered above the keys without pressing them. "You like the piano?" he asked. She gave the smallest nod. "Go ahead," he said softly. She pressed one key, then another. The sound was thin, uneven. But Jonathan didn't stop her. He just stood there, watching the first fragile notes of something he didn't yet understand take shape in his living room. By evening, she was back on the couch, wrapped in his jacket, her eyes closing long before the news came on. Jonathan sat in the armchair, the same thought circling in his mind. She wasn't just cold when he found her. She had been alone for a long time, and he wasn't going to let her be alone again. The days settled into a quiet rhythm. Imani rarely spoke, but she was never far from Jonathan's side. She sat at the table while he made breakfast, waited by the door when he took out the trash, and curled up in the armchair during his evening crossword puzzles. Her silence wasn't empty. It was watchful, like she was trying to understand what safety felt like. One afternoon, Jonathan came home from the grocery store to find her standing at the upright piano again. The sunlight from the window caught her face as her fingers hovered just above the keys. "You can play if you want," Jonathan said from the doorway. She hesitated, then pressed a single key. The sound was soft and tentative. She pressed another, then another. It wasn't music, not yet, but there was something deliberate in the way she touched the keys. That night she tried again, a broken scale. 3 notes forward, 2 notes back. It was uneven, almost hesitant, but Jonathan didn't correct her. He simply sat nearby, letting her explore at her own pace. A week later, on a Sunday morning, Jonathan was in the kitchen cooking scrambled eggs when a faint melody drifted through the air. He froze, spatula in hand, listening. It was Amazing Grace. Uneven, but recognizable, the notes trembling yet full of something raw. Jonathan stepped into the living room. Imani sat at the piano, her eyes closed, her small fingers moving lightly over the keys. "I heard it in church once," she said quietly when she noticed him watching. "I wanted to try." Jonathan knelt beside her. "You didn't just try, sweetheart. You made something beautiful." It was the first time he saw her smile. 2 weeks later, the paperwork went through and Jonathan became Imani's official foster parent. The change in her was slow but clear. She began humming to herself, painting with watercolors in the afternoons, and curling up with books in the evenings. But the piano was where she seemed most alive. Every late afternoon when golden sunlight spilled through the blinds, she sat at the bench and played. Sometimes it was simple hymns, other times playful tunes she half remembered. She was teaching herself, note by note, what it meant to have a voice. One Sunday after service, the church's pastor, Reverend Samuel Green, approached Jonathan. "I heard about Imani's playing," he said. "Would she like to perform during next week's service?" Imani looked uncertain. "You don't have to," Jonathan told her, "but if you want to, we'd love to hear you." The next Sunday, she wore a navy blue dress with tiny silver stars. The congregation grew quiet as she approached the piano. She took a deep breath and began to play "His Eye is on the Sparrow." Her hands moved with a surprising tenderness, and by the final note, there were tears in more than one pair of eyes. "She plays like someone who remembers things too deep for words," Reverend Green whispered to Jonathan. Imani didn't respond to the praise. She simply smiled, as if the music had said everything she needed to say. A few days later, Jonathan came home holding a flyer. "There's a youth music showcase downtown next month," he said. "No entry fee, just a chance to perform. What do you think?" "I'm not ready," she murmured. "You don't have to be perfect," Jonathan replied. "You just have to be real, and you already are." She thought about it for days before finally nodding. The night of the showcase, the auditorium was larger than she'd imagined. High ceilings arched overhead and rows of seats stretched into the shadows. Backstage, other children tuned instruments and tapped nervous rhythms on their legs. Imani wore a soft, sky-blue dress and white shoes Jonathan had polished until they gleamed. Her hands were steady, but her heart was racing. She peeked through the curtain and saw a boy in a velvet jacket performing with dazzling speed. The applause was thunderous. "I don't belong here," she whispered. Jonathan knelt in front of her, his graying beard brushing her dress. "You belong wherever your heart takes you. And if that place has a piano, then that's where you're meant to be. But what if they laugh? They won't. And if they don't clap—" Jonathan smiled gently. "Then they're the ones who didn't hear what I hear." A voice came over the intercom. "Contestant number 11, Imani Carter, please make your way to the stage." She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and walked out. When she sat at the piano, the room fell silent. She didn't play a famous song. She played something of her own. Soft, searching, full of questions and small bursts of hope. It wasn't flawless. A few notes wavered. A chord trembled. But it was hers. The last note lingered in the air. Then the applause came. Gentle at first, then stronger, until the audience rose to their feet. Backstage, Jonathan pulled her into a hug that nearly lifted her off the ground. "You were perfect," he whispered. "No," Imani said, burying her face in his coat. "I was me." As they were leaving, a woman in sharp glasses and a lanyard approached. "Mr. Miles? My name is Melody Sinclair. I work with the American Foundation for Young Musicians. We scout rare talent, children with exceptional musical intuition." Jonathan's brow lifted. "She's not just gifted," Melody continued. "She's exceptional. We'd like to offer her a full scholarship to our academy, private instructors, mentorship, national exposure." Jonathan looked down at Imani. "It's up to you, sweetheart." Imani hesitated. "Only if I can still play at church." Melody smiled. "Of course." The first day at the American Foundation for Young Musicians felt like stepping into another world. The academy occupied a renovated theater in Manhattan, high ceilings, marble floors, and hallways that echoed with scales, arpeggios, and snippets of every instrument imaginable. Imani clutched the strap of her backpack as Jonathan walked beside her. Melody Sinclair greeted them at the entrance, all brisk professionalism. "Welcome, Imani. Your instructors are eager to meet you." Jonathan watched as she was led down a hallway lined with practice rooms. Behind the glass doors, she caught glimpses of other young musicians. A girl with a violin tucked under her chin, a boy drumming with precise focus, a pianist playing with lightning speed. Her first instructor, Professor Charles Avery, was a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and a reputation for exacting standards. He had been skeptical, Melody admitted later. Most prodigy stories fizzled when the novelty wore off. But within minutes of hearing Imani play, his expression shifted from detached critique to quiet focus. "She doesn't just hit notes," he said to Jonathan after the lesson. "She listens to the spaces between them." Days blurred into weeks. Imani's schedule filled with theory classes, ear training, and hours of practice under Professor Avery's watchful eye. Jonathan kept his promise. She still played at church twice a month, the sanctuary always fuller when she was on the program. One afternoon, Melody showed her a video clip on a tablet. "Someone recorded your church performance and posted it online. It's gone viral. Over 2 million views." Imani frowned. "I didn't ask for that." "I know," Melody said gently. "But sometimes the world finds you before you're ready." Letters began arriving, emails from musicians across the country, messages from kids in shelters, and handwritten notes from strangers who said her music made them feel seen. Jonathan shielded her from the worst of it, reminding her, "This is your gift, not theirs to take." Then came the night that shifted everything. It was after a recital at the Midtown Cultural Center. Imani had just performed Light Between the Trees. a piece she'd been working on for weeks. As she and Jonathan walked toward the parking lot, she noticed a man standing under a tree across the street. Thin, nervous, watching. He didn't clap. He didn't speak. He just stared. Imani froze. Her breathing changed, her body going rigid. Jonathan immediately noticed. "Do you know him?" Her voice was barely audible. "I think I used to." Before Jonathan could say more, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the dark. The hum of the city returned, but the music in her seemed to fall silent. That night, she didn't touch the piano. Over the next few weeks, her melodies shifted. They became slower, darker, carrying a weight Jonathan hadn't heard before. Professor Avery mentioned it to him privately. "She's not losing skill. She's processing something. Let her." Jonathan understood. Healing was never a straight line. Then, on a cool September afternoon, there was a knock at Jonathan's apartment door. A woman in her early 40s stood there, wearing a deep maroon coat and holding a trembling envelope. "Mr. Miles, my name is Dr. Renee Lewis. I think I know Imani." Jonathan's shoulders tensed. "How?" Renee opened the envelope and handed him a faded photograph. In it, a little girl in a pale yellow dress stood beside a smiling young woman. The eyes, the curls, it was Imani. "She's my niece," Renee said. "She vanished 10 years ago. My brother took her and disappeared." Jonathan's voice was tight. "Your brother abandoned her." Renee's eyes glistened. "He was arrested last month, fraud, false IDs. He confessed that he left her somewhere because she wouldn't stop crying. The air in the room felt heavy." Just then, Imani appeared in the hallway, her eyes meeting Renee's. "Do you remember me?" Renee asked, her voice trembling. Imani stared for a long moment. "You were in a photo on a wall. I remember." DNA tests confirmed it. Renee was her biological aunt and her last living blood relative. Her mother had died a year after Imani vanished. Renee had spent years filing reports, chasing leads, and hitting dead ends. "I'm not here to take her away," Renee told Jonathan. "You raised her. You saved her. But if she's willing, I'd like to be part of her life." Jonathan turned to Imani. "It's your choice." Imani looked at Renee, then back at Jonathan. "You can come to my next concert," she said. "Let's start there." 2 weeks later, in a small but elegant concert hall, Imani wore gray slacks and a pearl-white blouse. She didn't play anyone else's song. She played her own. It was called Echoes from the Sidewalk. It began with 3 quiet notes, then built into a layered, mournful melody. It told a story of rain and rescue, of piano keys and chosen family. By the final chord, the audience was silent, then rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Backstage, Renee hugged her. "Your mother would be so proud." Imani nodded. "I hope she hears me." The idea began as a quiet conversation in Jonathan's living room a week after the Echoes from the Sidewalk concert. Imani sat cross-legged on the couch, a mug of tea in her hands, while Renee flipped through a folder. "You've got something rare," Renee said, tapping the cover. "Not just talent, reach. Kids listen to you. Adults listen to you. What if we built something lasting out of that?" Imani tilted her head. "Like what?" Renee slid the folder across the coffee table. Inside was a simple proposal. Music classes for homeless and at-risk youth. Donated instruments, volunteer teachers, partnerships with churches and community centers. Jonathan read over her shoulder. "We'd need a name." Imani set her mug down. Project Symphony. The name stuck. Within 3 months, they had their first class. 10 kids, 10 stories that carried more weight than any sheet music. They met in a borrowed room above a church in Bed-Stuy. The pianos were second-hand, their benches chipped and squeaky. Sheet music was taped to the walls in crooked rows. Imani, still only 13, taught the first session herself. She didn't lecture. She didn't hand out scales. She listened. "Play how you feel," she told them, "even if it sounds wrong." One boy, Mateo, sat at the keys and tapped the same 2 notes over and over. He was 7, couldn't read yet, but those 2 notes made him smile. "That's music," Imani said. "That's a start." A girl named Zoe played like she was fighting ghosts, sharp, fast, urgent. Imani sat beside her and whispered, "Let the ghosts speak, but don't let them win." The weeks turned into months. Word spread. By the end of the first year, Project Symphony had 40 students and a waiting list 3 times that size. But Imani didn't care about numbers. She cared about freedom, the kind she had found when Jonathan wrapped her in his jacket and gave her a piano to touch. During that time, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a correctional facility in Ohio. The name on the return address made her stomach tighten. Her biological father. She'd ignored his past attempts to contact her, but this letter was different. It was short. No apologies, no explanations. Just one question. "Do you ever play anything for me?" She sat with it for hours. That night, she composed a piece called Letter to the Hollow. It was slow, spacious, and haunting, with long pauses between notes as if she were answering a question without words. She recorded it, mailed the CD to the prison with a note. "You're not a villain in my music. You're an echo, that's all." She never heard back. She didn't need to. Months later, she accepted an invitation to perform at a juvenile detention center in Queens. The stage was just a cleared-out corner of the cafeteria. 40 boys in orange jumpsuits sat in metal chairs, watching with wary curiosity. She played Sidewalk to Sky, the piece she'd written about her journey from that street lamp to the life she lived now. When she finished, a boy in the back raised his hand. "Why would someone like you come here?" Imani met his gaze. "Because someone once sat beside me when I didn't matter. Now I do the same." After the performance, the staff wheeled the piano away. Jonathan stayed behind, talking quietly with the facility director. When he came back, he carried a small black box. "This is for you," he said. Inside was a simple silver ring, engraved with one word. "Seen." "I know I'm not your biological father," Jonathan said, his voice rough, "but I'm asking anyway, may I be your dad?" Imani didn't answer with words. She wrapped her arms around him so tightly it hurt. The adoption was finalized quietly. The local paper ran a small headline. "Silent adoption for rising star pianist." For Imani and Jonathan, it was the loudest moment of their lives. Project Symphony grew into a network. Renee coordinated new chapters, Jonathan taught 2 evenings a week, and Imani traveled between cities, splitting her time between performances and classes. The program reached hundreds, then thousands of children. Yet she refused to make it a brand. There were no glossy ads, no celebrity endorsements unless they genuinely wanted to help. She had one rule for every chapter: never look down, always look beside. By her 17th birthday, Project Symphony had reached over 10,000 students across 6 states. Universities studied its model. Mayors praised it. Nonprofits wanted to copy it. But for Imani, the work wasn't about recognition. It was about finding the next child sitting in the cold, feeling invisible, and showing them they weren't. And soon, she was about to stand on a stage that would force her to face both her success and the shadows of her past. By the time Autumn returned to New York, the city had learned Imani's name. Concert posters didn't use it as a brand so much as a promise, an evening where music meant more than applause. Invitations stacked on Renee's desk. Galas, televised specials, corporate partnerships with glossy language about elevating a story. Imani declined most of them. She would play schools, shelters, community halls, and the occasional revered stage, but never as a commodity. "Keep the mission simple," she told Renee and Jonathan during late-night check-ins around the kitchen table. "A piano, a teacher, a room where no one is forgotten." The rule stayed. The work deepened. London arrived like a long text in a different language. recognizable but larger than life. The Royal Conservatory extended a full scholarship in a small flat within walking distance of its old stone courtyard. Imani accepted, not to run from what she had built, but to sharpen the instrument she had become. In the conservatory's echoing rooms, she studied counterpoint at dawn, orchestration at noon, and piano technique until her fingertips ached. She walked home past wet cobbles and narrow bookshops, the Thames breathing quietly under its bridges. In crowded lecture halls or silent practice rooms, her voice stayed her own. Spare where others went grand, intimate where others reached for spectacle. On weekends, she video-called into Project Symphony classes back home. Matteo beamed through a cheap webcam, showing her the 5 songs he had conquered since that first 2-note smile. Zoe, fiercer and freer now, played a short piece she had written for her grandmother. Imani listened, nodded, and offered a single sentence to each student, never a critique without a door to walk through. When she returned to the States for a short winter tour, the welcome felt like a wave. Reporters angled for headlines, universities asked her to keynote, nonprofits wanted frameworks and white papers. She kept the schedule spare, a handful of performances, a day of classes at 2 new chapters, and a quiet visit to the Bed-Stuy Church, where she had first gathered 10 kids and a stack of chipped benches. In every city, she asked for the smallest room, the nearest out-of-tune upright, and time to sit with the ones who thought they didn't belong. The letter found her backstage at David Geffen Hall, folded twice and carried by an usher who looked as if he had been entrusted with a crown. The envelope was cream, the handwriting steady. "I promised your mother I would come if I ever found you." The woman at the door introduced herself as Claudine Marsh. A blue dress, a walking cane, and eyes that measured grief with tenderness. She had been Imani's mother's closest friend since grade school, she said. After Imani vanished, Claudine had searched quietly in the soft places official records ignored. Church basements, cousin networks, the barbershop rumor mill. Her name had never been on a form, but her hands had been on the work of finding. "I'm sorry to come like this," Claudine said, passing the letter into Imani's careful grip. "I kept it with me for years, hoping." The paper smelled faintly of lavender. The voice on the page was steady as a heartbeat. It told small stories. Lullabies hummed under kitchen light, a first word that had surprised them both, moon, said with a smile that wouldn't quit. It spoke of long afternoons in city offices, pleading for someone to follow a breadcrumb of a lead, and of nights when prayer became a second language for hope. "If anyone ever finds my baby," the letter ended, "tell her she was never lost to me." Imani read the last line twice. She folded the paper along its old creases and held it against her chest. Claudine's hand found her shoulder. Not a claim, just a presence. That night, Lincoln Center shimmered, all glass and glow against the winter dark. The hall filled with people who thought they knew what they had come for. Imani walked out in a simple black gown and a locket Jonathan had given her. Inside, a note that said, "Wherever the music takes you, I'm already there." She did not bow long. She did not speak. She sat. The piece had no preface and no famous name until the program posted it the following morning. On the stand, her handwritten title was clear, "The Letter That Found Me." It opened with a single note held in bare air, then a quiet second voice that answered from somewhere far away. The melody learned to walk before it tried to run. It faltered, reached back, rose again. There were empty measures where listeners could hear their own breathing, and there were measures dense with chords like arms gathering what had been scattered. At the center, a lullaby thread emerged, so soft that 1,000 people leaned forward at once. The ending did not explode. It arrived. 3 notes returned, the ones that had started everything now warmed by the journey between them. Silence held, and then the silence meant something. When the ovation rose, she stood, bowed once and stepped into the wings without waiting for the roar to crest. Her team waited with congratulatory words that could not touch what had just happened. She slipped past them gently, as if she were making room for someone else to breathe. Outside, the night greeted her without questions. Jonathan caught up half a block later and fell into step the way he always had. They crossed into the edge of Central Park and found a quiet street where winter light pooled on the sidewalk. Imani sat on the curb, her gown touching concrete. "You okay?" Jonathan asked. "I think I just said goodbye to a ghost," she answered. Not sad, not triumphant, simply true. In the weeks that followed, the headlines stretched to meet the story. Critics praised nuance over novelty. A university journal analyzed the piece's architecture and found, to its surprise, that the measurements did not explain the ache. Project Symphony grew again, not by strategy deck, but by invitation. Cities called. Churches called. A retired music teacher in Tulsa mailed a handwritten note. "I have a spinet piano and Tuesdays free." Imani said yes. She refused the offers that would have turned her into a logo. No perfume deal. No tour named after her pain. When a brand offered to amplify her platform, she smiled and asked for a dozen refurbished uprights delivered to shelters instead. The deal evaporated. 12 pianos appeared anyway, paid for quietly by people who understood. On her 20th birthday, Imani returned to the corner of Maple and 6th. Morning sun touched the bricks. The street lamp leaned the same way it had when she was 6, a familiar tilt in a city always changing. She came with a small crew and a carpenter from the church. Together they bolted a simple wooden bench to the sidewalk. The metal plaque read, "To the ones who feel invisible. You are seen. You are sound. You are the beginning of a miracle." No ribbon cutting, no speeches. She traced the letters with one finger, then sat for a long minute in the place where her life had widened. Years do not turn drama into quiet so much as teach it how to breathe. Imani finished her studies in London and returned often, not as a prodigy to be paraded, but as a composer who understood what music could repair and what it could not. She testified before panels that preferred statistics to stories and gave them both. She helped open music rooms in places where windows rattled with sirens and in places where the loudest sound was distance. Awards arrived like postcards from strangers. She accepted the ones that would buy more time for students and declined the ones that wanted her face more than her work. One spring afternoon, she walked her daughter, small, curly-haired, and serious, down Maple Avenue. The child held a tiny plastic keyboard with 2 missing stickers and the kind of reverence usually reserved for treasure. The bench waited beneath the leaning lamp. Imani sat. Her daughter climbed up beside her. "What are we waiting for?" the little girl asked. "For someone who needs to hear something," Imani said. "Can I play it?" Yes. The keyboard chirped awake, thin and bright against the city's hum. 2 tentative notes. A third. The shape of amazing grace, wobbly as a fawn and just as certain. Imani's eyes warmed. Across the street, a teenager slowed, turned, and stopped. He didn't move closer. He didn't take out his phone, he just listened. The kind of listening that changes the shape of a day. Imani didn't speak, she didn't need to. The bench said enough, the lamp remembered. The sidewalk, which had learned to hold both sorrow and rescue, held a new sound now. A child's first brave song, reaching toward someone who didn't yet know it was meant for him. The miracle had never been that Imani was found. It was that she kept finding others, quietly, steadily, without asking for anything in return, until the city learned to listen for what it once walked past. That evening, back at home, she placed her mother's letter beside her daughter's keyboard on the piano. She traced the old creases with a steady hand, then opened a blank page in her notebook and wrote the title of a new piece. She did not know its notes yet. Only this: it would begin with room for someone else to breathe, and it would end the way all of her best work ended, by making space for another voice to answer. Outside, the city exhaled. In rooms above churches and behind shelters and inside schools that still needed more than they had, pianos waited, teachers waited, Children waited. And wherever the music began, a bench beneath a leaning street lamp made sure there would always be a place to sit and listen long enough for the first note of a life to be heard. Some stories don't end, they begin again in someone else's life. Subscribe, like, and tell us your thoughts in the comments.